Only a year after the historic moment when man first stepped foot upon the surface of the moon, the American public at large had quickly become bored with spaceflight. Few were watching when the Apollo 13 mission launched on its great odyssey from the Earth to the moon, but suddenly became drawn in when an explosion had risked the lives of the 3 astronauts in one of the greatest rescue stories in history. Now people cared about flights to the moon again. Well, sort of. Many just watched to see what would go wrong this time. Even so, NASA was determined to show that it was capable of continuing the mission it had promised, and the man chosen to figuratively rescue the space program from the near disaster of Apollo 13 was the man who was originally supposed to fly it, and America's first man in space, Alan Shepard. And that first flight is where our story truly begins. In 1958, 7 test pilots were chosen to be America's first astronauts. These men were put through testing the likes of which no one had ever seen, and were widely regarded as the 7 greatest pilots in all of America. Further, the honor of being the very first to fly, the best of the 7, was a distinction that could not be overstated. And Alan B. Shepard had won that right, not only because of his incredible test flight background, but as he was considered to be the smartest of the 7. Not saying any of the astronauts were dumb, simply that he was, in the eyes of the scientific and medical community within NASA, the most apt to trace down and analyze potential problems should they occur, and a natural choice to make this first flight. And his flight was flawless. A 15-minute-long ballistic flight to test the spacecraft's ability to travel into the lifeless void beyond, and man's ability to function in this environment. It would not make orbit, but this test had to be done before orbit could be attempted. With this mission completed, Shepard was put back into flight rotation and eager to fly again. Even as a second class of astronauts was introduced, Shepard still maintained seniority, whether it be for another single flight or as commander of a 2-man Gemini flight. Indeed, as 1964 approached and the Mercury program was concluded, Shepard was assigned as commander of Gemini 3, America's first 2-man spacecraft, with rookie Tom Stafford at his side. Shepard was Navy born and bred. He could handle the most violent of seas, the highest and lowest of pressure. He could fly his craft upside down and backwards if need be. Nothing could stop Alan Shepard. Space was his calling, and it was all he wanted to do. It seemed, however, that his body had different plans. During that year, he would find strange periods in which he would lose his balance, become dizzy, or even feel like the world around him was spinning. Upon medical investigation, he was diagnosed with an inner ear infection, Meniere's disease. Essentially, excess lymphatic fluid in the inner ear canal, resulting in loss of equilibrium, and in extreme cases, severe nausea and vertigo. Such a condition would be disastrous in space. While Shepard would continue to perform well in training, and would attest in no uncertain terms in his flying ability, the medical determination was absolute, and he was grounded from spaceflight indefinitely. Deke Slayton, whom had himself been grounded because of a heart condition, had offered Shepard an administrative position within NASA, the very same job that Shepard had suggested for Slayton when he was first grounded. Though Shepard would make several attempts to overcome this determination, the condition was lingering and at the time incurable. The man whom had taken America into space, one of the greatest test pilots in the country, in fact the world, the man who had reached into space before even the famous John Glenn, would be grounded after having only flown for 15 minutes. He would do his job, of course, but he would gain a reputation as being very stern and strict in his application of management, and at times when the space program hit tragic lows, Shepard was miserable, and he took it out on everybody.
I was just man at the world. I rapidly became known as the icy commander, with not too much allowance for mistakes or frivolity or lack of performance among the astronauts.
I remember he'd walk into the astronaut office and he'd walk in with his briefcase and slam it down on a desk, and the other astronauts would be sitting in the room and they'd kind of, well, he's in that kind of a mood today.
We had an arrangement with Lola Morrow that have her put on the door a smiling owl or a very steely-eyed owl picture.
Many times the guys wouldn't even make it by the secretary's desk. They just take one look at the picture, turn around, and leave the icy commander to his own devices.
The boys threw Shepard a little reception, a kind of recognition award for his service, during which they'd put together a special little tribute video.
Only two had gone before, fellow pioneers into the unknown, Ham and Enos. Al studied their training procedures. He utilized their proven medical staff.
And I had thought briefly about getting up and interrupting at the microphone, but all of a sudden I realized there were two guys standing behind me, each of them weighed about 250 pounds, and there was no way that Shepard was going to get out of that chair.
How to succeed in space without really flying much. He got the point. The icy commander lightened up a bit and returned to his job. And naturally, like everyone in the program, spirits would lift when Neil Armstrong made the first steps upon the surface of the moon. And yet still, a piece of Shepard inside would think, that should be me up there. As the Apollo flight rotation rolled around, several events would make an impact upon the crew for Apollo 14. First would be the events of Apollo 7, in which head colds in the spacecraft resulted in frayed nerves between the crew and the ground, and Commander Wally Schirra being openly defiant and insubordinate. Before the flight, he had announced his impending retirement, so Schirra was beyond discipline. As a result, the remaining crew members, Walt Cunningham and Don Isley, would feel the brunt of Flight Director Chris Kraft's anger.
I learned at one time that Chris Kraft had listened to all of this nonsense going back and forth from the ground to the spacecraft and said that he didn't want any of those guys ever flying for him again.
I said the only way Cunningham will ever fly again is over my dead body. And he called me on the phone and asked me if that was the case, and I said, you got it straight from the horse's mouth.
While Cunningham was out, Isley found himself on the backup crew for Apollo 10, only because of open holes in the flight rotation that needed to be filled. Along with him was backup commander Gordo Cooper, a man who had constantly shown lapses in judgment when it came to training and attitudes toward authority. Apollo 10's backup assignment would essentially be his opportunity to prove his attitudes could improve, which they did not. Flight rotation would traditionally have a backup crew fly its prime crew 3 missions later, but Deke Slayton wasn't about to assign either Cooper or Isley to the flight. He needed an alternative option. The option would present itself when Alan Shepard would knock on his door and ask for the commander's chair of Apollo 13. This was highly unusual. Shepard was grounded and the medical community would never allow him to fly. It turns out that Tom Stafford had introduced Shepard to a surgeon who had developed an experimental cure for Meniere's disease. Without notifying anyone, he had agreed to the procedure, after which there were no signs of his condition. From his administrative position, Shepard was uniquely qualified to choose whom he had felt was the most capable, and his choices were Stuart Roosa and Edgar Mitchell, both rookies, but incredibly devoted and competent. Slayton all too eagerly agreed to his crew choice, but for the first time since taking the job, NASA rejected his crew selection. The previous grounded status, inexperienced crew, and the fact that Shepard had never served as backup all contributed to this judgment. Still, Slayton was determined to give this crew their chance, and so a compromise was reached. Shepard's crew would swap with Jim Lovell's crew, slated to fly Apollo 14, allowing for Shepard, Mitchell, and Roosa to put in extra training time, during which they had shown an intensity for the job that was almost second to none. No one would fight harder than Shepard to get his flight assignment, and on January 31st, 1971, almost 10 years after his 15-minute Mercury flight, America's first astronaut would make his way to the moon aboard Command Module Kitty Hawk, with Lunar Module Antares in tow. For the first time, Shepard would experience Earth orbit, his mere presence setting spaceflight firsts, as the oldest person at the time to fly in space, as well as the record for the longest time between flights. Now, he is about to do something that only 15 men in history had ever done at the time, and only 4 having made the final journey. It is a daunting challenge, and a distinct honor that America's first astronaut was worthy, and more than willing and able to undertake. Apollo 14 was now outbound toward the moon. But this would not happen without incident, as the mission would be called into question on the very first day. After the S-4B stage makes the burn toward the moon, the command service module separates from the booster, revealing the lunar module tucked behind protective fairings. As with all missions before, Kitty Hawk maneuvers around to extract Antares from the spent booster stage.
Houston, we're about to dock. Roger.
After maneuvering in for capture, the docking probe nestles into Antares' drogue and just bounces right back out. The soft dock would not engage. A second attempt and the same result. Antares would just not accept the latch.
Okay, Houston, we've hit it twice, and sure looks like we're closing fast enough. I'm going to back out here and try it again. Roger.
Coming in for a third time at significant velocity, hitting Antares pretty hard, and the same result.
Well, we better back off here and think about this one, Houston. We're unable to get a capture. Roger, Ed.
The lunar module is essential for any mission to the moon. If they could not dock with it, the mission could not continue.
Okay, Houston, we backed out a little bit, and that last time I hit it pretty good, and we're just not getting the capture latches in there.
Mission Control analyzes possible contingencies or alternative solutions to salvage the situation. At one point, Alan Shepard came across a crazy idea.
We began thinking about all possible ways to correct the docking problem. And one obvious way which occurred to me immediately was the fact that we could do it manually.
Al proposed to Houston that we put on our suits and depressurize the command module, and he would go outside and pull the two together.
Of course, the immediate reaction on the ground was, well, that guy Shepard really wants to get there, doesn't he?
Indeed, Al really wanted to get there, and no simple mechanical failure was going to get in his way. Fortunately, Houston came up with a simpler solution, making a soft approach and then pushing into the lunar module with continuous thrust. And hopefully in this exertion of force, the capture latches would react appropriately.
We got some, Houston. I believe I got a hard dock, Houston. Roger, Al, that's great. Super job, Stu.
And it worked. The probe retracted and hard dock was achieved. Antares was pulled free, and the combination spacecraft began its journey toward the moon. But its troubles were not over yet. Some in Mission Control expressed concerns regarding whether or not this docking problem could occur again after the return from the lunar surface. There was unfortunately no way to check for this, but if it were necessary, Shepard and Mitchell could perform an EVA from Antares back to Kitty Hawk after the lunar excursion, as the lunar module would no longer be needed afterward. Therefore, the mission was allowed to continue. After a trouble-free lunar orbit insertion, Shepard and Mitchell climb into Antares and prepare to make their descent toward the surface. As the final checklist is nearing completion, flight controllers see a strange signal. An abort command. Now, of course, neither man had their finger on the abort button, nor would they want to, but their computer was signaling as if the button was pressed. If this signal were to continue, the instant the descent began, the computer would respond to it by aborting the landing, jettisoning the descent stage, and initiating rendezvous with the orbiting command module. Several keystroke commands were entered, to no effect. Finally, Houston asked Mitchell to tap on the control panel next to the abort button, and after a few taps the signal cleared. This confirmed the suspicion that there was a loose connection, or something floating behind the panel, causing the switch to close. This meant the slightest vibration could cause it to happen again, especially the vibration of the lunar module's descent engine. NASA immediately turned to the computer programmers at MIT who originally developed the LEM computer, instructing them to write a command that would tell the computer to ignore the abort signal. This could subsequently present the risk of eliminating the abort option if needed, but such an abort could be accomplished manually. The first command developed was a no-go, as they would have to wait until after engine ignition to enter it, requiring the crew to rush in order to get it entered before the abort switch would close again, and any wrong keystroke could be catastrophic. After one more orbit, a second command was developed, which was far more appealing. It was not only far easier to enter, but could be entered before the burn, tricking the computer to think it was already in the abort mode, thus ignoring the abort switch entirely. With these new keystrokes entered, Antares makes its descent, firing its engine forward to slow its orbital speed, allowing the moon's gravity to start pulling it down. During the initial burn, the lunar module is on its back. After forward velocity is cancelled sufficiently, it pitches forward, using the engine thrust to slow its descent to a gentle touchdown. But before pitchover could commence, the landing radar had to lock onto the plotted landing point, which it refused to do. The area they were aiming for was a mountainous region with peaks 10,000 feet high, and until the landing radar locked on, they were flying blind. Mission rules had stated that if the radar wasn't working by 13,000 feet, Shepard would have to level off descent and abort.
Ground rules are sometimes made upon arbitrary decisions. Maybe one could have gone to a lower altitude before deciding to abort. Maybe one could have gone down to the point actually where one could pitch over and actually view the lunar surface. And of course, if one does that, then hypothetically one is able to make a safe landing. Finally, some bright young man in the control center realized, from looking at his indications, that the radar was in fact on, but it was locked up on infinity. So he said, well, let's turn it off and let it recycle, and I think it might work.
Antares, Houston would like you to cycle the landing radar breaker. Cycle. Okay, I would like to accept the radar. Abort radar. Oh, great.
The landing radar was now operational, and Antares made a smooth landing upon the surface. Near catastrophe averted, and Apollo 14 becomes only the third time in history humankind reaches the surface of another world. Shepard landing closer to the intended landing spot than any mission previous, and in fact any mission to follow. Pinpoint accuracy, second nature to a carrier pilot. Shortly thereafter, America's first man in space becomes the only man from Project Mercury to step out onto the lunar surface.
Okay, Al, beautiful. We can see you coming down the ladder right now. It looks like you're about on the bottom step and on the surface. Bedford, old man.
Okay, you're right. Al is on the surface, and it's been a long way, but we're here.
A long way. No doubt a reference to the 10-year gap between his two spaceflights, and the landing he had dreamed of.
And I can see the reason we have a tilt is because we landed on the slope. The landing gear struts appear to be about evenly depressed. Take a look at Fra Mauro. Take a look at Cone Crater, I should say, which is right where it should be, and is a very impressive sight.
In their first of two EVAs, Shepard and Mitchell would set up several experiment packages, including additional seismic equipment and solar wind composition experiments. The two ventured out further than any previous missions, using a rolling pull cart to carry samples and equipment with them. It would be during the second EVA that the two astronauts would attempt to reach the rim of nearby Cone Crater. This crater, approximately 1,000 feet wide, could be seen from orbit, but while on the surface, amidst the rolling hills, it was significantly more difficult to identify. In fact, they would be forced to return to Antares before finding their objective. It would be the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter decades later that would take the photographs of the landing site and see just how close they had come, turning around only 65 feet from the crater's rim. Despite this, Apollo 14 set a record for the longest distance traveled on the moon by foot, and they would return with an additional 100 pounds of lunar samples. Before ending their final EVA, Shepard took a moment to remove the end of the contingency sample rod and attach something to the end of it.
Well, Houston, while you're looking that up, you might recognize what I have in my hand is the handle for the contingency sample return. It just so happens to have a genuine 6 iron on the bottom of it. In my left hand, I have a little white pellet that's familiar to millions of Americans. Drop it down. Unfortunately, the suit is so stiff I can't do this with 2 hands, but I'm going to try a little sand trap shot here.
Shepard takes a few swings from his makeshift golf club and sends the ball flying off screen.
There we go. Raise the die. One more. That looked like a slice to me, Al. Miles and miles and miles.
Even though the distance was likely closer to 400 yards. Returning to Antares, they initiate the ascent burn and return to lunar orbit without incident. And after a rendezvous with Kitty Hawk, it was now time to see if the troublesome docking probe would work or not. And as the two craft came together in their first attempt...
Okay, we captured.
Beautiful, normal docking.
And we got a hard dock.
Beautiful. That big sigh of relief being breathed around here.
All over the world there is. You ought to try it from up here.
This world and out of this world, too.
No problems. No more issues pertaining to the docking that had potentially threatened the mission earlier. And no more false abort signals or false radar locks. From here on, it was smooth sailing all the way back home. And after nearly flawless re-entry, splashdown, and recovery, the 3 men and their samples were taken to a quarantine trailer for processing. And this would be the last time returning lunar astronauts would be required to remain in quarantine after the mission, as the scientific and medical community were agreeing that there was no actual danger. Apollo 14 executed this mission perfectly. So perfect, in fact, that the public at large grew bored with spaceflight once again. But regardless of how the public may or may not have felt about the great odyssey from the Earth to the Moon, the hard work of thousands, incredible skill of a precious few, and the incredible decade-long journey for America's first man in space will forever mark this week in space history. One may look back and wonder, what would Shepard have done had that landing radar not worked? Would he have disobeyed the order to abort? Only one man knows for sure.
Al, what were you going to do if the landing radar wasn't working by 13,000 feet? I looked at him and I said, Ed, you'll never know.
But he's not talking.